two guests from the participants. And you'll have to refresh my last names because I don't have my notes with me. Lavinia, I'm sorry.
Aguil.
What's that?
Aguil. Lavinia Aguil.
Aguil, who is with DCPS. I apologize.
I'm Lavinia Aguil. I'm from Capital City Charter School. I'm on the high school side.
And I'll let Todd introduce himself as well.
Hi, I'm Todd Bostic. I am with Van Ness Elementary School, which is DCPS.
Good, wonderful. And I think Krista Stevens is going to moderate the panel. We have some questions we're going to throw out and have folks respond about their experiences in the Institute. So thank you, and I apologize for the technical delay.
Right. So Chris, are you coming out to you?
I am. I'm actually just texting with Maria and letting her know because she isn't able to know what's happening. So I'm kind of keeping her informed, and then I'm also coming here. Here, these are my texts. So yeah, I will join. And one of the first things that we wanted to do was actually to give you all a bit of an overview about what M3I was. So this was something that it was a grant that was in response to kind of teacher advocacy and teacher voice around what was needed in terms of professional support and development for special education in DCPS, or in DC schools in general, actually. And what was identified that teachers were wanting support in general were how to support students in specific content areas like math and literacy. And they were wanting more content knowledge themselves in those areas. From my understanding, although any of my participants can add to this if you have something to add. And they were also looking for support in supporting students in social emotional learning. And so this institute was designed with a few things in mind. So we were hoping to do something that would, first of all, be a 3-week intensive in the summer. But a couple things that were taken into account were the fact that professional development and response to teacher voice about what they needed is typically most effective when it's something connected to their jobs, their daily lives, job embedded. So we were hoping to design that element into the Institute, as well as to provide them with something that wouldn't necessarily stop at the end of the Institute. And so after taking these 3 weeks of courses and training, the participants went back to their home schools and they actually designed a professional development for their own context, which ideally they were to be able to then take back to their school and share as kind of leaders in their environment. And we'll hear how that went as we keep with that's the overall design of the Institute. But one of the big things is it wasn't meant to be necessarily kind of a one-shot PD. It was designed to be a little bit longer and a little more sustainable than that. So the first thing that we'd like to do is actually to have everyone on our panel just introduce yourselves. And actually, first I'll start with Janet and Toby, and then we'll move on to Maria. But wondering about your own research interests and what appealed to you about being a part of this project.
You can start here. I'm Janet Walko, and as Doug said, I'm in this the School of Education at the University of Maryland, and my little subgroup is the Center for Mathematics Education. And I was a high school teacher for 10 years before going into academia, and one of the things that I found as a high school teacher was I just felt like we weren't connecting with the students enough with mathematics, and in particular algebra. It was a huge jump, and a lot of students just felt lost. I taught algebra probably all 10 years in different forms. I taught Algebra 1, I taught an introduction to algebra, and moved around. I taught in 3 different states. And so when I came into the College of Education, I was interested in how to help support children and teachers as well in algebra instruction. And so the first body of work that I was engaged in was looking at teachers can do in the classroom, so their content knowledge, but also what they're paying attention to in the classroom. So we call it teacher noticing, and it sounds kind of a funny thing to be specializing in, but the idea is there are 200 plus moments a teacher could attend to in the class, and so what are they actually picking up on and going with? And so that has huge implications for children's learning, children's efficacy, and I'm looking at that in the context of algebra. So that's one area. And then from the children's perspective, I'm interested in how children, so I look at mathematical cognition and how children learn algebra. So they start with arithmetic, but how can we smooth this transition from arithmetic to algebra? Things like, oh, if you add two numbers, you can do it either way. That's a very generalizable thing, and that can lead into algebraic thinking in the context of arithmetic. So those are the two things that I focus on. And what was particularly interesting to me about this project was I'd seen both in the field and also heard from special ed teachers, special education teachers, and supporters that sometimes when we focus on certain things, we tend to let the subject matter slide because you only have so many hours of PE. So I was really interested in thinking about how we can help teachers support students with deep content thinking. So that was one of the things that I've been interested in, and I'm sure more will come out as we talk.
So, as Doug said, I'm Toby Long, and I'm here at Georgetown at the Center for Child and Human Development, which is a sort of a research and training center that has a multitude of projects. And my specialty area is actually really young children with disabilities. But over the years, especially at our center, we have created sort of a model of looking at early childhood mental health within the context of disability or disability within the context of early childhood mental health, recognizing that the two cannot really be separated. So we've done a lot of work on mental health consultation in early childhood classrooms for kids with and without disabilities, and helping teachers especially recognize or be aware of special learning needs and being able to help them differentiate their instruction, not only for behavioral concerns, but for learning concerns, and helping them think of it as a total package. And in addition to that, I've worked here for a really long time in DC, so I've had many, many projects in DC public schools over the years, and in the Catholic schools in DC, and in the special schools in DC, and in the special schools that no longer exist in DC. And so it was very inviting to be able to be part of a group that brought teachers, especially those from DCPS and the charter schools, together to try to sort of tackle this bridging of social emotional learning with content learning. So that was really interesting for me on how we were going to be able to create sort of a curriculum that combines sort of algebraic thinking content, which was hard for me to imagine, and social emotional learning. The literacy piece was obviously a lot easier for me to conceptualize, but the work in the math really helped, I think, not only myself, but the participants really expand what we mean by creating an environment for kids to learn, a positive environment for kids to learn across content areas.
And we don't have Maria yet. Oh, we do. Oh, wonderful. So Maria.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Excellent. Very, very sorry. Very, very grateful for you guys making this work. But so my background is I was a public school and special education teacher for a good chunk of time, and I also worked in early childhood special education. So I have a lot of similar points in my history as Toby does, but also as does Janet. Right now, what I do is my research looks at kind of the inclusion or exclusion of children with disabilities within bilingual learning spaces, particularly focusing on kids who in school are considered English language learners, but in their household are considered emergent bilingual children, right? So they speak languages other than just English within their households and their community. The thing that was really interesting for me about this project and what drew me in was the possibility of creating intersectional practice. So I think a lot of what my work looks like that is the way that we are thinking about education intersectionally with kids who come from multiple types of backgrounds. And this offered me an opportunity to talk about the ways that we can address the different needs of kids, from their academic needs, their social emotional needs, and also their cultural identity needs within literacy projects. And how do we support teachers to be able to do that without feeling overwhelmed, right? So how can we show all of these connections across these different types of literacy programs in a way that they build on each other rather than making a teacher feel overwhelmed? And I've always, as a classroom teacher, have been really interested in professional development that takes place for teachers. And what I really liked about this was the intensiveness of the time period of the 3 weeks, so there was some continuity as opposed to the monthly kind of PD that I had traditionally been exposed to, and that I see a lot of my current teacher candidates, students, and graduates are exposed to.
And actually, Lavinia and Todd, I'd like to also ask you the same thing. So what drew you, tell us a little bit about your work, as well as what drew you to participate in the workshop.
So I'm a special education teacher. I taught for a good amount of time at a non-public school, a level 5 school, which basically means if you can't make it at a general education school because you are a hot mess in their eyes, you come to my school, or if you're going into jail or coming out of jail, you come to my school. Those were my babies. The ED babies were my babies. So I went from a school where I got to create the curriculum and do whatever I wanted because truthfully nobody cared about that. So nobody cared about what you were teaching as long as they were controlled from 8 o'clock to 3:30. So I came from there where I got to teach my version of world history. I got to pick my authors from English. And then I went to a public charter school that was still a really good public charter school, Capital City. And you get a lot of freedom still, but I didn't get to do as much as I wanted, and I had to share the classroom because there's a general education teacher and then there's me. So I'm inclusion. So all of my children that I'm servicing are within the inclusion. So I had to fight for them to have certain books in the classroom. I had to fight for us not to do certain things, and I was kind of sick of fighting, and I wanted the backup of like, hey, this is why we shouldn't have all these authors. This is why we should decolonize our syllabus. This is why our babies need to see this certain type of stuff. So that's what brought me to this.
Great. So again, my name is Todd Bostic. I teach elementary school, special education. This is my second career. So actually, I started 10 years ago teaching through the New Teachers Project, and started off at a dual language school. Boy, do I wish I had known some of what I learned during Institute when I was there, just as far as translanguaging and lots of the great things that we learned. But so I spent time there working specifically with elementary school kids. I worked in nonprofit management before and liked going to work. Not loved going to work, but liked going to work. So decided to do something that I loved doing, and I haven't looked back. It's been amazing. I recently moved to another school that was reopening after being closed for about 8 years, a DCPS school in the Navy Yard neighborhood. So if you know that neighborhood, it tore down lots of public housing, rebuilt the neighborhood, and as families are moving back to the neighborhood that were displaced from public housing, they're moving back into the neighborhood. So our school is incredibly diverse. We started off with 5 classrooms, pre-K 3, pre-K 4, and 1 kindergarten classroom. And now we just added grade 4 this year. So I've gotten to see the building of a special education program. I was the only special educator there, and now we have a team. And it's been wonderful to actually watch that. But my big area that I'm most interested in is inclusion, and making sure that kids that I work with specifically are no different than any other kids. And one thing that drew me to the Institute was the thought that I'm going to develop content knowledge that can be used across the gen ed population, the special education population. I just like to, I don't want to differentiate between the 2 populations. And I got that. I was very lucky that I got lots of ideas on how to include a range of kids. It was very useful in terms of talking about that.
And this is a little bit of a follow-up question, but what did you find from all of these different perspectives that you brought to the Institute? What did you find was most needed and important about what you were doing, either in participating or in leading? And it could be something, again, from your own context that you've seen was really needed and important, or something that maybe in going through the Institute you realized was really needed and important.
Well, I can start. I think Lavinia sort of mentioned this in her introduction. I think it was really important for me, from the feedback from the participants in our discussions, it's really important for them to feel empowered to argue for what they knew was right. One of the things that I think really surprised me when we talk about inclusion, I think that we all have different definitions of inclusion, which is really unfortunate. But for me, I'm like Todd. Kids are kids. I wish they would get rid of special education and just have education and teach teachers how to differentiate. All teachers learn to differentiate so they can teach any of the kids that are in their classroom. But we need those tools. Maybe in elementary school, for the elementary school participants, it may have been a little bit easier for them to feel sort of empowered to do that. I remember a couple of the high school participants said, well, you know, we say inclusion, but nobody really wants my kids. You know, so how can they be an inclusion teacher when they feel that their school doesn't want their kids or being part of the school? And especially in high school with their major structural systems, it's hard for one teacher to feel that powerful to be able to make that difference.
One of the things, I had written a syllabus before the 3 weeks started, and then as we started to go through, a lot of it changed. And my goals really, first it was content, and I was thinking about content and how can I help people feel more empowered with this content. And then I was thinking, well, let's just break down what it is to think mathematically and what it is to think algebraically. And so before even starting with the content, I ended up backing up and just kind of just reshaping everybody's idea about, or trying to help reshape their ideas about what mathematics is, how we can participate in mathematics for themselves as teachers, and then also for entry points for their students. So we spent a good amount of time thinking about what does it mean to do math. We can have, what does a challenging problem look like? How can a problem that seems really challenging have multiple entry points? And so speaking to Toby's idea of just differentiating for the classroom, I thought that in order to differentiate, we really had to reframe some of our ideas about what mathematics is and who can participate. So there's a lot of daily reformulating.
I think, yes, go ahead. Okay. I think for me, one of the things that came through from the experience itself is how much teachers crave opportunities to collaborate and build knowledge together. I think one of the things that I found really kind of affirming from this experience was that teachers have a lot of expertise, right? And they're doing a lot of the things that we think they should be doing, right? Quote unquote, should be doing, but they just don't necessarily have the language to present it in that way. And so, like when I was talking about things like translanguaging or like culturally sustaining literacy and those kinds of pedagogies, teachers like, oh yeah, and I've done this and I've done that, right? But they haven't really had the space to do it, right? Or to talk about it, or even to just get that positive feedback of, yeah, this is great, and this is how you support it, and this is how you allow it to meet the needs of your students and your professional identity. So I think the other thing that's kind of needed, and what was kind of great about this project, was that it was trying to support teacher autonomy while also developing teacher leadership, right? So the idea that these teachers would participate here and return to their school communities to be able to talk about the work that they did is also a really powerful thing that's needed in professional development in general.
And for the teachers, what, we'll do,
Here's just a quick question. What is translanguaging?
Oh, sorry, sure. I muted myself right after I stopped talking. So translanguaging is kind of a theoretical framework that looks at the ways that kids who are multilingual use language. So typically when we talk about language practices for multilingual children, we talk about their languages as if they're autonomous, kind of separate things, right? So let's look at a Spanish and English speaker. They speak Spanish and they speak English. Translanguaging actually looks at both of these language systems as one whole linguistic repertoire, right? So that's all that you have. So what we traditionally think about as code switching, right, which is based on the listener looking at a speaker and saying, oh, that child isn't able to stick to one linguistic code. We actually look at it, translanguaging looks at it from the speaker's perspective of they're using all of their linguistic resources to make meaning, to communicate, right? So understanding that that's what a student is doing and then turning that into a pedagogical practice where you're creating room for languages with intention and with purpose, and that you're doing it in a way that supports students' emotional understanding and awareness of their language, right? And so it makes them feel good about their communities, it makes them feel good about the language they hear their families talking, and it also allows them to develop content knowledge while they're still building linguistic knowledge in whatever the school language may be.
and for you who participated, what felt really needed and important about this?
Collaboration. The collaboration was great. We broke into groups several times a week. So it wasn't just a chance to work with the people sitting next to you. It was a chance to work with really people across the board. It was great to have DCPS and charter schools together. Each charter school with its own personality, with bringing different things to the table. We did lots of presentations, but a great opportunity to work with other people. Sometimes as a special educator, I sometimes feel like I'm on an island. I'm attached to a grade level at my current school, but yet I'm not really, I'm part of the grade level, but I'm still not one of the, I'm not the ELA teacher or the math teacher. I'm a special education teacher. And they're kind of like, yeah, okay, so you fit into this group, but you're still, so it's, it was really great to have it. And the entire institute wasn't all about special education. I don't think that term was used very often at all. And the content was what could be used by any educator. Like Toby said, if we just had educators that could differentiate and work with all kids, it would just be amazing. And I think that many schools are working towards that. But yeah, so the collaboration was great, and the ability to actually take content area and make it accessible for the kids that I work with specifically. Entry points, the way they respond, how I'm going to assess them. It's made me really rethink my entire approach to assessment, entire approach to planning my lessons and unit plans.
For me, it was just the fact that it was pre-K all the way to high school teachers that were there. I really appreciated that because just because I'm a high school teacher doesn't mean that I don't have kids that are reading on second grade level or kindergarten level, that I don't have ID kids. So having that different way of viewing, because there's a reason I'm not a middle school or elementary school, I don't touch that area. And like, I, just put so much distance between it because I don't want to teach that. But at the same time,
So much fun.
No, I have a second grader. I'm good. That is all I. So, because of that, like I'm still able to see like how they would do or how they would approach something or how they would break something down in a different way.
I think that was something that was really great for me too, to see all the different kinds of classroom structures that you all come from, all the teachers came from. I assumed when they wrote their applications, when all the participants wrote their applications, they described the classrooms and they said, oh, I work in an inclusionary classroom and I have these kinds of kids in it. And I thought it was just one big happy classroom, and then they would say, well, no, we're really split, or we're in the same room together, but we don't plan together, we don't teach together. And it made me really reinforce that inclusion is a sort of a wastebasket term that we're all using possibly differently.
So to kind of continue on this thread, I would be interested from all of your perspectives, what did you gain from participating in the project in the capacity that you participated? And what could teachers and school-based personnel potentially gain as well? Let's start with you. So you've shared a little bit, but let's hear a little more about your gains from participating in the project.
Sorry, I get distracted very easily. We always say, like, if you're a special education teacher, you're a special education teacher for a reason, because you yourself know how it feels to, like, you know. But my biggest gain probably was the cultural relevant pedagogy and just being able to take that. Also seeing the pieces that you think you know, but like Maria definitely let like us know the pieces that are missing. Like you think, I mean, I didn't think this, but it was really good that I had this stuff to go back when I did my PD, that it was like, okay, just because like, yes, you're a science teacher and you put up a brown scientist, okay, that's not enough. Like, oh, yay, we're reading, you know, like one book by Toni Morrison. That's not enough. It's not supposed to be just like one highlight. It's supposed to be ingrained in the curriculum. And one of the biggest things that I really went back and drilled into my colleagues' heads was disability as a culture that she was telling us about. So a lot of times we think that we're being inclusive, but we're not. Like even just today, I had to break down to a student, we were talking about different types of oppression, and none of them could have even talk about ableism or think about it. And I was like, do you guys understand that when you go to a restaurant, what do you do when you look up a restaurant? They're like, oh, we look and see how many Yelp stars it has, or like what they say or how cheap it is. I'm like, but do you wonder about where the bathroom is? Do you wonder, like, you know, like anything like that? And they're like, why would we care about the bathroom? I'm like, if you're in a wheelchair and the bathroom is on another level, you either have to plan out when you're going to the bathroom, or you have to see if it's accessible for you to go up, or you just have to not go to that restaurant. Like, so it's a lot of things like that that our kids don't think about, and that even our like staff doesn't think about. So it's having them to like incorporate that into their actual lessons. So we have a lot of students with like, when we say inclusion, we're really included. I'm co-planning with both my teachers. We are doing different types of things. I'm in the class with my kids. I'm not just the inclusion. I'm not teaching just my inclusion babies. Like, believe me, every kid's coming to me, like for some reason. So that was one thing. And then we also talked about like, it was a lot of stuff we talked about. So it was really just good to take back. And I was going back assuming that I was gonna have my two co-teachers that are white. This year I have a Latino and a Black co-teacher, which truthfully I'm so happy about, because that emotional of me being the brown DC based, like I'm from your hood and not living your hood, like I'm that point that it becomes emotionally exhausting. You know, like I'm not supposed to be all of like, we need to share this. So they gave me a lot of stuff too, to like be able to just have like share the load. And it was just a lot of data that I was able to come back with, and a lot of different ways to just teach our kids. So yeah.
And I literally the first day I walked in, I did not know what to expect. We have access to a lot of PD. It's either how to write an IEP, behavior management, crisis intervention, and then there's also the math PD and the ELA PD, which is constantly, whenever I'm taking it, not differentiated for any students. I'm not talking about kids with disabilities. I'm talking about any kid that is at various levels. And some curriculum in DCPS has their own curriculum that we use. Not all of it easy to differentiate, not all of it easy to modify. And one thing I came out of the Institute with was just a totally different way of introducing content. Math was what I started off with. I started my year off with my fourth graders using a problem that we developed at Institute, and giving them a simple word problem. And they're like, great, this is easy. This is gonna be easy. Your fourth grade is easy. And you know, specifically, we're looking at place values. Specifically, we're looking at rounding as two of the skills I needed to start off the year with. and was able to actually put into that lesson, that wasn't a lesson, it was a series of lessons of, culturally relevant thinking. We engaged in a conversation about income disparity. And at first, my kids were like, this isn't math. What are we doing? And really, it was almost uncomfortable for them at first because it's not how they approach math. So what I came out of this with was just a totally different way of thinking about planning and then delivering lessons. That was interesting. And at first, my kids were maybe not as interested because they're like, what are we talking about? Why are we talking about income disparity? Why are we talking about the metro system within DC? Why are we talking about Georgetown being inaccessible? Things like that all came out in the project that we developed over a year. So it's there's a lot of Me Too's, like you said. I agree with a lot of it. I'm fortunate to come from a school that opened from scratch, and we have a school leader who is really big on making sure things are culturally relevant. So we have a library that's not just set up with a few books of Frederick Douglass here and whoever else on the other point of it. Really, the classrooms look like our kids. And I don't look like the kids I teach. That's just something, and I can't change that no matter what I do, but I can gain a better understanding of how I can put things into lessons so that the lessons look more like my students, or feel more like my students. They have a better understanding.
And for the presenters as well, what did you gain from undertaking this project? Kind of work.
So one of the things, it had been a while since I'd been in the classroom, and when I was in the classroom, I was in Chicago and New York, and so just getting a sense of what's happening in DC public schools and how we can help support teachers and the resources they're coming in with. That was very, very helpful for me. And like I said, each day I felt like I was kind of changing the lesson a little bit, and what I ended up with versus what I had planned before going in looked quite different. And so it was really listening to the teachers and figuring out what they wanted to get out of it and how to best support them in their classrooms. So it was a big learning experience for me. Currently being at the University of Maryland, we're with, I'm doing a project in DC public schools now, but we work a lot with our pre-service teachers going to Maryland public schools. So it was really nice to see what the DC teachers are bringing.
So I think the experience reminded me of how much teachers know and how much they're not regarded as knowing. And we tried really hard to build in lots of those kind of experiences, group experiences. Todd, you really enjoyed them. I'm not sure everybody enjoyed them as much, but and making you work with different people from around the room. And it was great, the amount of sharing and amount of creativity that you all bring to everything that we do in hopes of improving how we approach interactions with kids is real impressive. Just a really great reminder to keep on doing that, because obviously the media doesn't help to remind us on that.
I think for me, the thing I got out of it the most was just how much joy there is in learning for adults. And I think working together, we laughed a lot, which was really fun. But also just, again, like how much is created when people are offered the opportunity to cultivate the knowledge that they've gathered. There was one more thing I was escaping my mind. Oh, but also just like the overwhelming dedication of teachers to like voluntarily sign up for 3 weeks in the summertime, to like develop their own practice in ways that they'll have to negotiate with their school leadership and with external expectations and high stakes testing, and everyone was really invested. Like I didn't really feel this sense of disconnect across people. People showed up and they really showed up, wide-eyed and bushy-tailed kind of presence, which is great for me coming from teaching undergrads sometimes at 8:30 in the morning. They're less than enthused to be in the room.
So you talked a little bit about what worked, and feel free to add to that, but also what didn't work for you in the model. So we chatted a little bit about this different kind of model that we took. So again, this 3-week intensive, and then the teachers were going to bring it back to their own context. So curious from everyone's perspective, you know, what worked and what didn't, and what were some of the drawbacks of the model that we had, if there were.
My one thing was, like you, I'm not a group person. Like when you guys force us to, like I hate that. Like I hate it so much. I hate when we do PDs and we do icebreakers. I'm like, oh, I don't care about you. Like can we just do this? When they talk about north, south, east, west, like what you are, like the north is like let's just do it. South is all about feelings. Like west, and I'm a north. Like let's just do what we're supposed to do. Like if we're gonna become friends, it'll happen. But can we just get it done? So that was very like, for me. And my other thing was just when we had to write the IP goals, because and I know this is gonna sound cocky, but I'm great at writing IP goals. Like I know how to write IP goals. Like that's like something I'm really, really like. I've been trained really well by like multiple people. So that was the one thing that was just like, oh, okay. So those were my 2 main things.
So I loved the group stuff. But, probably didn't like the individual stuff that we did afterward as much. But you know, and I had the same issue too. I looked at my IT people and I'm like, these are really great. I have worked on these and they're really important. And but I did look at them from a different lens. And so I did bring something else to it to look at it. And we did a lesson plan and I looked at the lesson plan completely different. And one of the things, this is a drawback or not, but I learned things that I had to redo the plans I had for the beginning of the school year. Like, this is all new information that I'm going to use right now. So I have to scrap some of my lessons that I already planned, which was really a good thing. It just pushed me not to keep doing the same thing. I don't like doing the same thing. And the institute was somewhat, it was a cross between a graduate school course and a PD. It was a really unique experience. But there weren't a lot of drawbacks. I think that one thing we could change is do the reading assignments in advance, because we did have the bulk of the summer before Institute started. I would have loved to have read things in advance and not been reading it during the week of, because there was not a lot of reading, but there was enough, and I would rather just analyze the reading that I had already done.
Yeah, I think that kind of piggybacks on, I'll piggyback on that, which is just the logistics of it was a little bit hard, just negotiating. Also like the data, so we collected some of the data, but then it wasn't, some of it was like on what grade levels and schools teachers were at when they applied for the program, which then was different by the time that they came to the summer program. So for example, like I had picked out literature and kind of groups based on the data we had, but then it changed, and so some of that was a little bit tricky. And I think access to materials, I agree with that. Like I think it would have been awesome to have been able to provide materials in advance, even if it's on some digital platform, because then it would have given us a little bit more time to do a little bit of a deep dig into the work.
I don't know if this is feasible, but I was just thinking about how it was divided into 3 content weeks. And I wonder, and I don't know from the participant's perspective, whether having some kind of a spiraling or like more of an intermingling of the content would have been helpful. Because I think about, because we had a mass social justice focus, and I think about how we could have really brought in some of the other strands. So I think that might be logistically tricky, but it's a question.
Well, that was sort of one of my concerns. But I had a couple. I'm like Lydia. I'm in North too. You know, when Onyx says we have to have an icebreaker, I go, you plan the icebreaker. I don't care less what the icebreaker is. I'll go along, but that's just fine. But when we were planning it, logistics, happen. And I think that if we would do it again, I think it would be better to be much more integrated and having, rather than the social emotional component, almost be the last because of logistics. If we could have introduced it throughout and used it as a basis rather than a content area. Because we all recognize that social emotional is an overlay. It's not well, today we teach social emotional. Unlike, you can say, well, Monday at 3 is our math lesson, and that would have been much more helpful, I think, to demonstrate that as a integrated component of the learning environment.
And that's also because it's not one of my focuses. So having, so it would have been interesting to learn and kind of feedback off of it. I did do a lot of reading prior to the workshop about social emotional learning and how I can integrate it, but I think having that kind of back and forth.
And bringing in some, now that I sort of reflect back on it, maybe beginning of some brain science things on learning and how that social emotional piece is affected by brain science, to give it more, I think, elevated background for the participants. Also, 3 weeks seems like a long time. I thought it was just like too short.
It was too short. There was a lot of information that I think that we didn't rush through it, that I think that we could have done a deeper dive.
So that's actually a great transition into the next question, which is how do we sustain? So you mentioned all these takeaways in these games, and how do we sustain this kind of learning? So one aspect of that is that the participants were designing then a PD to take back to their own environment. I kind of want to zoom in on that for a bit and hear a little bit about how that went for you, and also, so in general, some of the feedback was for many participants, there were some structural challenges in actually being able to bring this PD back. So I'm not sure if you had any of those experiences, but I'm interested in hearing what some of those are as we think about how we can design PD that really is something that can be built off of and sustainable and also can really be taken back into schools. So I wonder if either of you faced any of those challenges at all when you went back to take your PD, and what are some things that we could do some things that we could do to kind of support that when we're designing a PD like this.
My school is great. I mean, I've done a lot of stuff since then, so I can talk about the good stuff.
Yeah,
if you
tell
want
us how it
challenges.
went. Tell us how
I
it
mean,
went.
my school is pretty good, and I'm very aggressive, and so like when I will just keep on bugging until I get what I want. So basically, I'm English and World History inclusion for 10th grade. So what I do is I'm in 2 classrooms, and last year we do these things called expeditions, which are basically I'm an expeditionary school, learning whatever. So like we have to do the Holocaust. So you're learning about the Holocaust and world history, and then we're reading about like things that have to do with the Holocaust in English, and then they're doing things on nuclear bombs and chemistry. And last year I was like, guys, like no offense, but I'm sick of the Holocaust, and if I'm sick of the Holocaust, I know my 10th graders are too. Like they're now becoming numb to it because they're so sick of listening to it, and like it became a whole thing too, because my kids were like, we don't learn about this, we don't learn about that, like what are we doing? So I let my kids get really angry and like, go at admin. So I'd be like, see, this is what happened because we just keep on learning about the Holocaust and not other genocides. So what I did is I went to my admin, and with the stuff with culturally relevant pedagogy, I was like, look, I'll create the whole curriculum map for English and world history. And instead of us reading only about Holocaust, we're going to talk about the Holocaust because it's really important that we teach it, and it's like something that they know, but we're going to compare it to other genocides that happened. Like, why do we not talk about what happened in Congo? Why do we not talk about what happened in Armenia? Why don't we talk about like the indigenous people? Like that was a genocide. So all of those stories together, we're learning world history, and then we're going to do the stories of people in English. And like narratives and all that stuff. So they still are hitting the common cores. Like, believe me, Maria gave me the Very Hungry Caterpillar and told me to create a high school, what is it called? A lesson plan with the high school, for the high school on the Very Hungry Caterpillar. I took that and we turned it into Ward 7 and 8 and all the wards in DC. And like, I actually have taught that actual lesson plan. So I did Monday's Not Coming, and then I made my kids go. They were each like a representative of each ward, and then they had to find the disparities. And I used math, and they had to use like, you know, like the circumference and see like what does it mean if it's a food desert, like what is the circumference of them having to get fresh food. So they did already that. So I've taken that and I've applied it to real world. So like now I'm doing that. So I feel like just make sure that they have a voice and they learn how to like speak up and they're not scared to like get backlash, because there's always somebody going to tell you not to do something. You just have to annoy them enough until they do it, and you have to have the kids annoy them too. Because if you have the kids annoy them, then it's like, oh, Fox can be here real quick about how you don't want to teach about slavery, but okay. So like, that's me. So
I think one thing though that's coming through from what you're saying is that you also have a real strong understanding of the community in which you're teaching, and the communities that your students come from. So I wonder if one thing that would support future PDs is us doing some like looking at the communities where your schools are located, right? Looking at the communities where your students are living to really draw those connections, right? To be able to draw that in with the literacy component, to be able to draw it in with the math. Like, I think that what you're saying, right, is and a strength that's yours, which is amazing, but it's not necessarily a strength that's of everyone's, right? Especially if they don't feel connected, if they don't work in the community in which they live.
And that was certainly something that I think we all struggled with. We never really had a handle of all the various schools and the populations in the school. So one person, I forget her name, taught at Wilson. Well, many of us are familiar with Wilson, but I was not familiar with really the population of your school. So that was really hard for me to sort of put myself in your place in your school to get a picture of what it's like, what are the kids like, what is the neighborhood like. Saying Ward 7 or Ward 8 doesn't necessarily tell you anything, because it could be pockets within those wards, or Ward 5 or Ward 4. So that doesn't necessarily help. We had more time to allow you to share your experiences and what you are the classrooms that you're teaching in. It's been real helpful.
So I'm probably not as pushy as far as like when I came back with the PD. And we had already planned out pre-service week for us the week before we go back to school. There was not a minute I could have fit my PD into it for this. And I came back going, I have a PD that I would like to present to the entire school. And I'm on the academic leadership team. I knew that was done. So there was no time to squeeze into it. And then I'm thinking, well, I have until the end of September. I can do this. And then time kept creeping by, and the logical group were the special educators in my school and the rest of the special education team. And actually, there were 3 other people that applied for institute that didn't get an invitation. So I was the only one. So it was like kind of like train the trainer. I was able to go back and say this is what it was about, but I did not do it justice. I was not able to do it. Of course, you can't take a 45-minute hour PD and make it into everything that M3I was. Very difficult to do. So mine was to a smaller population, although I still have that PD, and that PD is still relevant. What the content that I have in there is still relevant, and I tend to use it again. But I think that I didn't have a broad of an audience that I would have liked. And also we have, at my school, we have incredibly experienced teachers. It's difficult to say to an experienced teacher, I'm going to give you a PD that's going to teach you how to teach differently. Because some of them would have looked at me and said, I don't think so. But not that they're fixed in how they teach, they're just amazing educators. Yeah, and you're talking about populations of neighborhoods and stuff like that. My school is incredibly diverse. It is both the beauty of my school and the challenge of my school, because we have everything as far as economic status, as far as race goes. We have mostly an in-boundary school, and in the Navy Yard, you have subsidized housing right next to $1.4 million townhouses, but it's kind of like tucked away all in there. So it all looks beautiful, but you have subsidized housing tucked in there, which is great. But the experience that our kids are bringing and the trauma that our kids are bringing to school totally different. And I mean, we have to, in the social emotional content, it's so important to our school because we have to be able to respond to, give them skills that are applicable for a really broad population. And within DCPS, that's not typically the norm. Typically the schools are, you can give a school, you can say Wilson, you can say Deal Middle School, you can define it. Yes, there are exceptions within it, but our school is one that you can't really just define because it's just so diverse. So it's a challenge to make a lesson work for every kid.
And I love that idea that just about like, especially if it's more integrated, thinking about, okay, let's take this first week to really explore the school districts, and you can use math, and you can use all kinds of other ways to look at it as well. You can do statistics, you can look at just many different aspects, and then you can kind of build up from there. So it's like really connected to the whole school.
And, you know, it certainly, you know, that is really sort of clever to think that that's what we could structure it that way, in which then we could investigate sort of trauma and what, you know, we all assume what trauma is, but some kids who don't appear to be having experienced trauma, or you would not think because of their background, they could have been just as traumatized as the kid who has all the sort of external factors. Yeah, all the ACEs, exactly. And what are the protective factors that they bring to the table? Or what protective factors did the school create to help them, to mitigate those effects? So, yeah. More time, exactly. And then one of the other things that we talked about was, and that we wanted to do, but we weren't able to, was to have sort of a beginning of a community practice or a learning community that goes through, so you guys could stay in connected with one another and with us, rather than thinking, now, obviously it sounds like you guys have carried forth, but we don't know what the other folks have done. They could have just put this 3 weeks aside, said, oh, that's done, move on to the next event.
Maria, did you want to say anything about this question?
You're back.
Oh, okay. Even if you want to take this back, but if you feel like you're the only person, or if you feel like one of your more junior faculty or teachers at your school, that also makes it really hard if you don't have kind of that internal or external support. I wonder if something too that we could think about moving forward is about cohorts from school. And maybe that would also kind of be a way to grow the work and ensure that you do get the opportunity to do the PD, because it's multiple people who are now invested in the school and multiple people who can take on the turnkey responsibility and the leadership of the work. And, you know, share many hands makes less light work, right?
And also gives that support when they go back, that there's a team to build off of one another and support one another.
And to check in and be like, hey, I have this lesson, right? Like, this makes sense with that thing that we learned, right? That we talked about. And there were a couple of people who were teachers in the same school communities, and you could see them kind of sneaking off to the side and being like, okay, so this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to talk about it with other people. And it would have been nice to be able to have that for everyone, even if it's at a district level, not necessarily at a school level.
That's what I was thinking too, because there's that trade-off of a limited number of participants, having multiple from one school or having at least one in many schools. And so having that like a district level or just a proximity of a tiny little support cohorts, not even necessarily.
And then some of them changed.
Yeah.
I never would have thought that would happen. It's like, oh, well, I'm going to a different school. Like, oh.
Well, I'll ask one final question to each of the panelists to sort of tie this all together, and then we'll turn it over to a little bit of Q&A time. So the last question I have, and you may have addressed this a little bit in different ways already, but what do you feel like from having gone through this experience, what is your takeaway about what we need in professional development? So this is a broad question, and it might be very different for each participant if you have different interpretations of it. But one thing I'll point out that has been interesting for me in speaking with you and listening to you all is Also, this interdisciplinary aspect of this professional development was something I think is also not as common and very interesting. And I feel like the work across disciplines and across perspectives seems like it yielded a lot of fruit. And so if every participant in the panel has a totally different answer based on their own perspective, that is just fine. That makes it even richer. So again, just wondering your takeaways about what we need in professional development in general.
I think so. When we look at the literature on professional development, so they have a lot of design principles that should be sustained to connect to their, it should be discipline specific. In some cases, it should connect to their work in the schools. And so we have some of those things, but I think that the things that have arisen, at least for me, to the surface of a lot of these conversations are like, yeah, the interdisciplinarity and how we can really capitalize on that. And then also just how to sustain. And we've had some ideas come up, but really kind of really giving some time and thought to how to sustain, whether it's district level cohorts or like a forum or some type of online community or both. I think those things are important. And what this is really making me, this conversation excited about is this idea that when I came prior to working this year on the project, the math content was kind of nebulous. So I was thinking, okay, it could be content and these are the things I want them to get from the content. But now I feel like having the content be exploring neighborhoods, looking at distance from grocery stores, looking at how many, looking at like employment rates and all those things. So it can be the fodder for the math content in order to make this more, it disciplines more and ingrained in it. So it's an exciting thought.
Yeah, I think my thoughts are similar. I feel like we're having a lot of conversations about culturally sustaining work without necessarily talking about what we mean by culture. And I think some of the work that's needed in professional development is just developing common language. And offering opportunities and spaces for teachers to share the ways in which they're encountering this work. I think the fact that most of the people in the program hadn't really thought about disability as a culture, right, but are working within special education classrooms and with children who are identified as having a disability, that is a really fruitful opportunity, right, to think about disability history as also an important cultural tenet, to think about accessibility within their communities and their neighborhoods, right? I think that all of those are really great places to go to. So, doing the culturally sustaining work and overlapping it, but recognizing that students with disabilities don't just need academic support, right? That academic support can be delivered in ways that are also good for their souls and also good for the souls of educators.
And it, like similar to Janet, I think that we created sort of content for our area sort of before, obviously. So we had an idea and we had some parameters from OSSI and from the grant. But if I had to do it, so in the case of social emotional, we focused on the CASTLE framework because that's what DCPS or OSSI is sort of adopting. But if I had to do it again, I would look much more into trauma. We didn't talk about ACEs. We didn't talk about the variety of experiences that come into the classrooms that the teachers have to respond to and what they feel are difficult for them or they don't feel like they have the skills for, or if they do have the skills and how to share those skills.
I have to piggyback on that. More PDs on what my kids are bringing to school with them that's getting in the way of their learning. There are a lot of PDs on academic content, not the way we did it in Institute though. Social justice was a part of math. I mean, really that kind of blew my mind because it's just not something I put together. And I have an engineering degree, undergrad. I know math, but social justice.